In the last lecture video, I talked about finding substitutes for whatever it is that we really want, because substitutes are hardly ever as good as the real thing. If they were, they'd just be what we want. Getting one still leaves you unsatisfied. So you'll always be looking for that thing you want, and that's a habit. Needs are left unsatisfied when ego is weak, when you can't control yourself, when you don't know how the world works, when you don't know how to get what you want. So childhood is hugely important to the development of your personality. In fact, Freud divides childhood up into stages, each one having to do with a type of need that's especially likely to cause you trouble at that time in your life. During your first couple of years, those are oral needs, anything having to do with eating, with the mouth, with the whole digestive tract. Everything else, like urinating, defecating, staying warm and dry, that's not much of an issue for a little baby. Somebody's taking care of it. But oral needs might actually go unmet. When they aren't getting met, there's no breast around, or mom withdraws her nipple from a teething baby, then the kid gets frustrated. That's what stimulates the development of ego, and that's good. But more frustration than the kid can handle means it's going to have to find substitutes for what it really wants, oral pleasure. And it becomes orally fixated. And what happens if the kid has been getting too much oral satisfaction? In other words, there's no frustration. Then ego doesn't develop. So the kid never learns to deal appropriately with reality. All it knows is orality. So once mom's breast disappears, and eventually it will, the kid can't deal with it. And it's left scrambling for oral pleasure. It becomes orally fixated, and it has to find substitutes. And what kind of pleasure are we talking about here? You could sum up the ways in which babies use their mouths in order to get satisfied, to feel good, as incorporative, sucking, holding on, swallowing, and aggressive, biting or spitting. And true Freudians are pretty literal about the sucking and biting and whatnot, which seems to be why people generally think this stuff looks kind of silly. But Neo-Freudians treat oral behavior as a manifestation of deeper issues. It's not important in itself. It reflects conflicts having to do with a kid's relationship with its parents. So for them, taking things in and holding on, or in other words, being incorporative, isn't about breasts and nipples. It's about parents and a helpless kid developing a sense of trust and confidence in its parents. Biting and spitting, the aggressive stuff, are about pushing parents who aren't trustworthy away. Anyway, becoming fixated on incorporative behaviors means the child will grow up to do things like smoke, drink, and eat too much. And they'll be gullible. In other words, they'll swallow anything. They'll be a sucker. And you certainly can find more oral traits on the web if that's something you feel like doing. And, among other things, becoming fixated on aggressive behaviors, aggressive oral behaviors, leads to things like nail biting, chewing toothpicks, and being sarcastic. This oral metaphor, by the way, and the idea of substitution comes up a lot in the real world, and here are a couple of examples of that. Apart from these fixations, oral needs aren't much of an issue after the age of 2 or so. But parents get tired of the diaper thing at about this time and start toilet training. So suddenly, anal pleasure becomes important. The kid learns that holding off on a bowel movement, yes, you heard me right, can make the subsequent bowel movement feel really good. In other words, if you let tension build up, then letting go of it later can feel extra good. Ideally, the kid figures out during toilet training that a little frustration is acceptable, if not even worthwhile. And by the way, at this point, you might ask yourself why. I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say that kids learn that frustration is acceptable, but what would be going through the little kid's mind that makes it think that some frustration would be acceptable or even worthwhile? But it does, according to Freud, and it starts controlling its own bowels. But if the parents have been too demanding during toilet training about when the kid should go or when the kid shouldn't go, the kid never learns to control itself appropriately, to strike some sort of balance between frustration and release. So the kid either accepts the parent's complete authority and becomes very rigid and over-controlled so as not to do anything that would upset the folks, becomes anal retentive, or it rejects their control and does whatever he or she pleases. That's the anal expulsive type. And this has actually been called a diuretic fixation. If the parents were too lenient, no rules, no guidance, the kid never gets frustrated and never learns that controlling itself can be good. And again, you might ask yourself, why would the kid ever think that controlling itself can be good? It apparently does, because we've all been toilet trained. So when confronted with the inevitable reality of having to use toilets and not soil itself, it either fixates on retention or expulsion. In other words, if it never developed a realistic way of thinking about its bowel movements, about the value of controlling itself and not controlling itself, then urges will fill that vacuum. What are those urges? Retention and expulsion. So you could drop all this anal talk and, in addition to perhaps feeling a whole lot more comfortable, just describe this stage in terms of control. Does the kid develop appropriate ideas about when and how to control itself? Some balanced way of thinking about its autonomy? Or, instead, is it over-controlled? Anal retentive, extremely neat and tidy, saving everything good for later, saving everything fun for later. And again, on the web, you can find more examples of anal retentive behaviors. Or is it under-controlled, anal expulsive, unwilling to accept authority, messy, willful, throwing tantrums?